Hey, everybody, welcome to the Crit House. I'm Jeff Larson, and we are continuing with our My Five series. And joining us here, he's been on the program once or twice before, is Sean Tucker, who has really one of the most amazing YouTube channels that is out there, a very popular one. Sean, welcome to the Crit House again. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I know you as a street photographer, but I know you do portrait work as well. But one of the things I wanted to have people say is like, what do you think of yourself? How do you talk about yourself as a photographer to other folks out there?
I mean, I guess there's slightly multidisciplinary, and I mean, I began professionally in photography in food and product photography, so that was my bread and butter for a long time. But then I transitioned over to doing street photography as kind of an antidote to the very technical day job. But I would probably say portrait photographer first. It's definitely always been a first love. It's the most interesting sort of photography I do for me. And it's probably where I've spent the most time and effort building my technical skills. But it's certainly never been like a huge money maker for me or anything. But that's where I kind of put myself first, I reckon.
Good. So we're going to look at 5 photographs that you have chosen. And I can't remember how I described it to you. I probably said we're talking about 5 photographs of your choice. And that's sometimes hard for people to come up with 5 images. I mean, there are literally millions of photographs that are out there. How do you choose which you think are the 5 most noteworthy or meaningful or the greatest photographs ever? What did you go through when I told you that?
Did I get it wrong?
There's no wrong.
You're kind of messing with my perfectionist, my inner perfectionist. I was thinking like, I had to just get to the stage where I went like, this can't be the most important 5 images to me, because it would take 6 months of soul searching to work out what those are. But I just went back and found 5 that immediately jumped out to me as images that I remember off the top of my head as being little turning points in my journey that taught me something. And just kept it that simple. It's definitely a much longer list than 5, and these might not be the top 5, but they're definitely 5 important ones that I could access in my brain in the week that you gave me. So something like that, I think.
Well, everyone I have talked to has said, if you ask me tomorrow, it'll be a different 5 images. Yeah. So let's take a look at what you have come up with is Sean Tucker's My 5. So there can probably be no more of a classic image than CartierBresson. Tell us why you chose this one and what it meant to you and why it's here.
I mean, I think the rule is you have to have a Bresson photograph in your lineup, don't you? This one for me it's not even the image that's important for me. The lesson that it taught me is that it's the story behind the image. So I heard Cartier-Bresson giving an interview about this image, and I think this is one of those images that people like to add layers of meaning to. It's a station in Paris. It was shot in about 1932, I think. So he's talking like between the world wars. And I've heard people sort of saying, yeah, well, what he's doing, what the artist is doing is there's a ladder and human beings are trying to make progress. And we're trying to, leap over and get over our issues and the problems in the world. But there's a broken hoop in the foreground. So that's talking about, broken modernity after the First World War and our disillusionment with the way that the world's going. And listening to he was basically asked, why did you take the image? What does it mean to you? And he said, well, there was a fence and I couldn't really see through, but I knew the composition was kind of nice when I stuck my eye up to the hole, but I could only have my eye up to the hole or the camera. I couldn't have both. So I just kind of stuck my camera through the hole. I sort of saw someone come in and took a shot and it just turned out okay. And I kind of love that kind of like, sometimes it's okay to just take a photograph because you like the look of it. Let everyone else add the huge layers of meaning to it and everything else. Because I think I have that experience a lot. People ask you, what did you mean when you took this image? What are you trying to say with this image? And I'm often not. And it kind of, that story with this image gave me permission to go, sometimes it's enough just to take a photograph you like the look of and let everyone else argue about it because you've done your job, and that's why this image, more than the technical, I mean, obviously it's an interesting shot and the reflections and that kind of very crunchy contrast and black and white and the time it is and the lettering on the signs and everything really speaks to an era. And I think the older an image gets, the more of that kind of mystique it gathers as it goes. But I like the fact that just in one interview, he unpicked all that and went, I just liked it. That was it.
Perfect. Number 2 for you. Tell us about this and why it means something to you.
Yeah, so this is an image by, it's a portrait taken by an American photographer named Edward Curtis. And it was shot in 1909. So Edward Curtis basically, he photographed from 1900 to 1930, so 30 years of his life. And he gave himself the goal of traveling around the US, trying to capture portraits of the different Native American tribes around the country before they disappeared because they were being decimated, and he wanted to capture that culture. And what really impressed me, I mean, this image is great, but I mean, honestly, it's just a representation for me of his whole body of work, which he put in a 10-volume set called the North American Indian, I think. And it really is trying to be an anthropomorphic visual catalog of the culture around the country that was being lost. He was shooting on, you know, a large format glass plate, having to, you know, take that equipment over in wagons over bumpy tracks in very unstable terrain and develop that stuff in the field. For me, Edward Curtis represents the amount of work it takes to do really great work, you know, and how giving yourself an incredible task like that will maybe take a lifetime. And maybe, I mean, he didn't really see the success of his work in his lifetime. His work was kind of rediscovered later and sort of brought to the fore. Yeah, work ethic is what he does. And obviously the image itself is beautiful. I love the contrast on it, that kind of one light. He was kind of setting up tents with flaps so he could let in light and shape it and control it, all natural light, obviously. And there was just, I think it's a really arresting image of really important subject matter.
It is, and a complex history behind his work as well. Your number 3, Fan Ho, an amazing, amazing image.
Again, might be kind of a representation of his work in general, but Fan Ho for me was street photography was important because there was a stage early on where I was taking photographs, and it really was just kind of light and shadow play. And I was challenged by people, this isn't really street photography because there's not enough kind of human life reportage going on. And then that's when I found Fan Ho's work. And his work was obviously in the 50s, mostly in Hong Kong. And images like this, where, you know, subject's anonymous, it's very deep, dark, negative space in the shadows and the exposure and everything else. And it gives such a sense of mood and place. It doesn't, and the human being is really for scale. You can't identify them or see expressions on faces or really that much of an action. But it gave me permission on my journey to keep doing what I was already doing, because if someone like this could have done that, then we all have permission to do the same. So he kind of unlocked a direction for me, him and a few others. But this image I remember particular popping up. I think this was the first image of his I found that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole.
Your number 4, sir.
Yeah, so this is an image taken by an American photographer named Joey L. or Joey Lawrence, who I followed from quite early on. He's a Canadian photographer, I think, actually. I think he's born in Canada. And his first gig, he was basically shooting bands and making, you know, lights out of, you know, cardboard boxes and baking film to kind of really kind of just rough stuff, putting it together. And he got picked up because people sort of saw this guy's work and thought, this kid is so talented. He actually photographed the first Twilight movie that came out. He was asked to photograph the poster at 19 years old. So that's his kind of break onto the scene. And he's got an amazing body of commercial work, but I'm less interested in his commercial stuff. This image is one of his personal projects, and those are the ones I really follow. So he's been to the Omo Valley many times in Ethiopia. This was from a particular set that he made with the holy men on the banks of the Ganges in Varanasi in India. And this is one of the sadhus there. And an 85-year-old guy, he sort of asked him, obviously beautiful image in terms of the lighting and everything else, and his dreadlocks kind of wrapped over his shoulder. It looks like clothing, like it's an amazingly striking image and an amazing face. But Joey L, for me, looking at his work, taught me how to use natural light and strobe in combination. So at the beginning, I watched him really use those strobes quite heavily and really darken down his background. But this represents for me kind of the midpoint of his journey. Now he still uses strobes, but they're almost invisible. This midpoint was a sweet spot for me where I went, wow, what you can do is rather than just rely on the natural light that's available, you can bring one light with you. and then create a far more dramatic image that's part of the landscape, mixing natural light and strobe. So as a technical step for me, this was kind of an important moment, realizing the potential of creating your own light in portraits, beyond obviously the fact that the character is beautiful. And if you look up the whole body of work, it's stunning. Yeah.
Your number fives.
So yeah, this is a quite famous shot by Steve McCurry. And I think this was probably one of the earliest ones that kind of hit me. Wasn't sure who this was. Steve McCurry was introduced to me by my friend Doug, who we kind of started in photography together, and we would share people that we discovered and talk about, you know, what we're seeing in the images. And this was taken in Sri Lanka. These I'm not even sure if this still happens now. This was shot quite a few years ago, maybe in the 80s, where fishermen climb up on these stilt platforms that they create, and they fish into the surf. And Steve obviously was somebody who worked for National Geographic for years, and he had my dream job. Like, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to travel around. I wanted to photograph cultures that were different from mine and tell these visual stories. And that kind of work is obviously gone now. It's an era that doesn't really exist the same way now. It's much harder to do. But this particular image showed me how you could be technically proficient on top of relying on the fact that your subjects are interesting. I think it's a really masterfully composed image. The elements and the subject are really spread out well. Everything's kind of placed well. There's lovely kind of lines through everything, leading lines through everything. So he's gone there and he's gone, this is an interesting scene, but I'm not just going to rely on the fact that people will find this interesting if I take an average photograph on it. He, for me, is somebody who constantly pushed himself to create beautiful compositions out of the scenes that he was making. So, and then, you know, going down rabbit holes with his work as well. I found his Afghanistan work and found way more of the same, and just somebody who for me challenges me that, you know, work a scene. Don't just rely on the fact that the subject's interesting. You make sure that you use all your technical skill to make it shine as best you can as a visual element, as a well-composed set of subjects within a frame.
Yeah, it brings to mind, I heard one time somebody, a photographer, say, if you want to take an interesting picture, stand in front of something interesting.
Yeah.
But he goes that next step. He's not only in front of something interesting, but he has created something out of that interesting subject as well. Sean Tucker, thank you so much for joining us here on the Crit House again, showing 5 images. And again, I'm sure you could have come up with a load more to talk about, but it's been fascinating to hear your thoughts on these images, and it's always a pleasure talking to you on the Crit House. Thanks for joining us, and thank you all for watching the Crit House.